Hi, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this virtual session of the UC Davis History Club. My name is Dr. Stacy Farenthold, and I am an assistant professor of migration history here at UC Davis. You might know me because I teach courses on migration and refugees in modern history. I also teach comparative histories of partition, as well as courses on the Eastern Mediterranean, Syria, Lebanon, and the modern Middle East in the 19th and 20th centuries. What you might not know about me yet is that I also write and publish on migration in the region, specifically on Arab migration in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Americas, from Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. I recently published a brand new book on the politics of Syrian migration during the First World War. It's called Between the Ottomans and the Entente, the First World War in the Syrian and Lebanese Diaspora. And it's an honor to come to the UC Davis History Club and discuss my book with you all. Before I begin, I'd like to just thank the History Club, all of you, and especially the coordinator, Jennifer Alpers, who not only invited me to participate in your lecture series, but in these weird times with our statewide lockdown, Jennifer also found a way for us to meet virtually by embracing the same technologies that we're all now using in the classroom. So thank you all for your efforts. It's really an honor to take part in this. Here's how it's going to work. With the presentation that follows is about 40 minutes. It's pre-recorded, so you all can watch it in whole or in part at your leisure before our meeting on Thursday, May 7th, 2020. I have also made a chapter of the book. Chapter 5 of this book is available to you all in PDF, but of course there's no reading required to participate, and you can take a look at it or not, depending on your level of interest. On May 7th, we will meet live via Zoom. The History Club will put out an announcement about that, and we can have a conversation about the presentation or any aspect of the work or about World War I in the Middle East. It can be Q&A, it can be part conversation, and it can be part just hanging out. If you'd like to submit any questions to me in advance, you can contact either Jennifer or myself via email. I'm open to that. So let me just start by sharing our slides, and we will get moving. Okay, so with that, I'll begin with the story of how World War I went down in the Syrian diaspora, and I want to begin with the trouble that began in the Syrian community of Buenos Aires on April 12, 1915. On that day, the Consul General of the Ottoman Empire stood atop the steps of his own consulate. A Syrian Arab and Ottoman subject, Amin Arslan faced out from his office. He gazed upon a crowd of 1,000 Syrians, Lebanese, and Palestinians who had come from all over Buenos Aires to hear an announcement. 1915 was a deeply troubled time for the Syrian diaspora. Just months before, the Ottoman Empire had entered the First World War, and Istanbul's ruling party had allied with Germany in that war. The decision to go to combat was a deeply unpopular one. It was resented by Syrians at home and also in a massive Syrian diaspora, stretching from Argentina and Brazil to the United States. In this diasporic space, Amin Arslan's opinion mattered. As Ottoman Consul General and representative of the empire's ruling party, the Syrians of Argentina had come to hear what he thought of a war against the Allies. Arslan wasn't a man who liked to disappoint his constituents. Mounting the podium that day, he told the crowd that he had received a letter from the city's German consulate. That letter from the Germans demanded that he show his support for the Ottoman-German alliance and that he command the Syrians of Argentina to patriotism. Arslan read the letter, and the crowd hissed and cursed and heckled. Raising his hands for silence, Arslan then read to them a reply he had written for Berlin and its diplomatic staff abroad, and I quote, "Senor Consul General, I have the pleasure of acknowledging your letter, but it has not yet come to my attention that my Ottoman Empire forms a mere part of your German Imperium. I have only loyalty to my august sovereign, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and my only superior, the Grand Vizier. I keep hope for the honor and dignity of my poor country, dragged unwillingly into the abyss of this war by you, a savage foreign power." Enraptured in the moment's passions, Arslan then marched the crowd across the city to the German consulate to deliver the letter by hand himself. Totally appalled by all of this, the Germans sent a complaint to Arslan's superiors in Istanbul, and the following month, in May of 1915, the empire's foreign minister, Talat Pasha, sent a telegram terminating Arslan from his post, ordering closed the entire consulate in Buenos Aires, and demanding that Arslan immediately return home for discipline. Arslan refused loudly to return home, and he was duly hit with a treason charge, but of course he could only be tried in absentia. For the rest of the war, the Ottoman consulate in Buenos Aires remained closed, and its windows were nailed shut. Wary of a repeat performance elsewhere by Syrians in diaspora, Istanbul then shuttered all of its consulates across the Americas, cutting ties with Syrian immigrants and marooning them abroad. Amin Arslan's story is the first one I describe in my new book, Between the Ottomans and the Entente, which is a political study of political confrontations in the Syrian diaspora during the First World War. The war years were a time of cataclysmic shifts in the Middle East. In the Middle East. We have state failure in the Ottoman Empire, famine, humanitarian crises, and foreign intervention in the Arab world, the rise of new nationalist movements, partition, and forced transfer of refugees. All of this went on as an enormous diaspora of Ottoman Arabs watched from overseas. All told, 500,000 Syrians, fully 20% of Syria's total population, Syria including both Mount Lebanon and Palestine in this study, 500,000 of these people lived in the Americas by World War I. My goal in my work is not merely to tell a story of this war from their diasporic perspectives, although I believe the book accomplishes that. Rather, I want to demonstrate how political confrontations that happened in this space, in this diaspora, transformed the modern Middle East and its politics precisely at the moment that the Ottoman Empire fell and the European mandate system rose to take its place. Amin Arslan's last stand on the steps of the Ottoman consulate represents a moment of rupture that then rippled out to the Syrian colonies across the Americas. It was a microburst of rebellion that would soon be repeated in Sao Paulo, Brazil, in New York City, in Havana, Cuba, in Boston, from Cuba to Chile to Canada. Emigre political parties that had once been Young Turk, patriots, and pro-reform Ottomanists began to call for separation from Istanbul. They created new flags like this one, and they funneled funding to revolutionaries fighting the Ottomans in the Levant. They petitioned the Allied powers, conducted espionage into their neighbors, and recruited for the pro-Entente armies then fighting the Ottoman Empire. And when the Allied powers proved victorious over the Ottomans in 1918, these same diasporic political parties petitioned for rights of national self-determination over the Arab Middle East. They leveraged their diplomatic, military, and intelligence networks in order to have a say in the redrawing of the map of their homeland. The Ottoman Empire did not always treat its Arabic-speaking diaspora with suspicion. In fact, Istanbul's 1915 disengagement had been really abrupt. In the previous decade, the Young Turk Revolution had brought the ruling party, this Committee of Union and Progress Party, to power. The CUP party swept aside the aging Sultan Abdelhamid II in order to restore the empire to constitutional rule. That had been in July of 1908, and the Young Turk revolutionaries traced their own origins in an exilic movement. Consequently, the Committee for Union and Progress saw the Syrian diaspora as potential partners for the restoration of Ottoman greatness. The Young Turks wanted to reinvest the emigrants into their own empire of origin. They built new consulates in New York and Washington, in Rio de Janeiro, in Sao Paulo, and in Buenos Aires, all of them cities with large Syrian migrant communities. That same Committee of Union and Progress Party also established a network of pro-CUP political clubs, and they subsidized literally dozens of Syrian and Arabic language newspapers across the Americas. In the press, the Ottoman Empire posted its propaganda, and it extolled the virtues and obligations of diasporic patriotism. When Amin Arslan himself had first come to Argentina in 1910, he helped found a remittance bank. He was in talks for a bilateral guest worker program with the Argentinian government, and he stamped the passports of Ottoman repatriates returning to the empire from abroad permanently. So before the Ottomans had entered the war, they had seen the Syrian diaspora not as a dangerous place, but as something more like an offshore frontier province, a space that, though lightly governed, was nevertheless governable. This approach to managing the diaspora was in keeping with longer-standing Ottoman principles that eschewed the hard and fast lines of territorial borders in favor of the flexibility of frontiers. It was a governance strategy that would fall apart along with the empire after the war. So in 1914, Istanbul made the fateful decision to enter that European war, declaring war on both Great Britain and France. The Committee of Union Progress sent a general named Jamal Pasha to govern Syria. And when Jamal Pasha arrived, he managed the province as a supply line to feed Ottoman troops already fighting a two-front war in both Anatolia and Suez. The Allies, meanwhile, blockaded the Eastern Mediterranean seaports, cutting off access to weapons, but also to food and medicine. Syria, Mount Lebanon, and Palestine were all threatened with critical food shortages, and when the 1915 wheat crop failed, the region tipped into a famine the following year, and by 1918, that famine had killed a startling 18% of Syria's total population. This is about triple the rate of mortality in France during the First World War. Meanwhile, from across the ocean, Syrians who lived in Brazil, Argentina, and the United States watched in horror as this humanitarian crisis mounted and deepened. When Syrian journalists criticized the Ottoman state, Jamal Pasha rounded up and hanged dozens of men in the public squares of Beirut and Damascus. Led by emigre journalists living abroad, Syrians cried out sharply, calling for revolution against Istanbul and for the first time for separation from the Ottoman Empire. Using distance as their ally, they asked the Entente powers, the Allies, for assistance in these objectives, all from the relative safety of diaspora. In the book, I detail several ways in which the Syrian clubs of the diaspora resisted Ottoman rule from abroad. This includes the translation, production, and smuggling of propaganda, the raising of funds for Arab revolutionaries fighting in the Hejaz, the conduct of espionage into their Turkish-speaking neighbors, and the drawing of ambitious new maps like this one for a post-Ottoman Middle East based on some blend of confessional demography, natural landscapes, or their own understandings about national self-determination. This map is one of the earliest the earliest of what later became the state of Greater Lebanon in 1920. It was drafted by a Lebanese independentist party that was organizing between Cairo, Sao Paulo, and New York City in 1917. And it formed the basis for this party's negotiations with the Entente powers upon the war's conclusion. This particular map was published by the Lebanon League of Progress, again pictured here, these guys standing in Brazil under the state's proposed new flag, a white standard with a green Lebanese cedar situated at its center. One major way that the emigre clubs worked with the Entente that I'll now elaborate on was military recruitment during the war. We have a man pictured here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but he's second from the left, second from the right, from the far right, next to the man holding the flag. This is a 1904 picture. The man here, his name is Shukri Behesh. In 1914, he's in Brazil standing underneath this Lebanese flag, and 3 years later, he's moved from Brazil to New York City, where he is printing American propaganda and recruiting Syrian men for the US Army as a formal Army recruiter. Syrian clubs in Brazil, Argentina, and the United States helped mobilize around 10,000 Arab men into the French, Canadian, and US armies during the First World War. Because it was technically illegal for Ottoman subjects to join the Allied armed forces, Syrian troops were offered a series of passports and travel passes, granting them an interstitial legal status as not quite citizens of their adopted countries, but no longer entirely Ottoman subjects either. Syrian recruiters carried packets of these blank passports with them across the Americas, where they held rallies to popularize the war effort and to collect Arab volunteers. In the stump speeches at these recruitment meetings, recruiters situated military service as having a dual purpose. First, fighting for the Entente was an act of resistance against the Ottomans, a means by which the Syrian diaspora could physically liberate its homeland. Second, and attached to this, joining the army was an act of immigrant patriotism, a symbolic inclusion in the American context. Crucially, the recruitment campaigns were managed entirely by émigré political clubs who vetted recruits themselves while operating beyond formal state oversight. So this was not a government project, it was a private recruitment project. The system granted these private migrant clubs, like the Lebanon League of Progress, an extraordinary power to determine who had access to passports, and with these passports, the right to proclaim a post-Ottoman legal status and even a nationality. Military recruitment was the most visible resistance activity in this diaspora during the war, but it was also a major source of tension within the Syrian neighborhoods. Among recruiters themselves, there were competing cells of nationalists who were pushing for homeland projects that were very much at odds with one another. As they vied for political preeminence and often vied for the same pool of manpower, they weren't above using mob tactics or political violence to accomplish their goals. These two men, Shukri Behesh, we've already met at the left, and now Muqarrasol at the right, developed an intense personal rivalry during the war. As president of the Lebanon League of Progress, Muqarrasol, at right, enlisted men for the French infantry under the banner of an independent Lebanese state that would be separate both from the Ottoman Empire as well as from neighboring Syria. Shukri Behesh, by contrast, was critical of French collaboration, and he recruited for the US Army on behalf of an increasingly Arab nationalist project that rejected the notion of Lebanese independence from Syria. When Behesh left Brooklyn, where he lived, to go recruit volunteers in Latin America, Muqarrasol took advantage of his absence in order to recruit him to the feds for anti-American political activities. Behesh was in Argentina when he learned that he had actually been indicted for treason, or sedition rather. Not quite treason, but sedition. He hastened home to answer to the sedition charge, and he abandoned several dozen recruits in Argentina along the way. Behesh then got to New York and revealed that he was working for the US Army, and the US government dropped the charges. But no sooner had he cleared his own name than he lobbed retaliatory accusations back at Muqarrasol and his partisans in Brooklyn. Muqarrasol then spent the next several months jammed up under investigation for passport fraud, linked to the very blank passport documents that the French Foreign Ministry had given him for the purposes of military recruiting. In addition to those struggles, many Syrian immigrants remain actively opposed to the separatist movements altogether, either because of genuine pro-Ottoman loyalties or because they had correctly identified the Allies' ambitions in the Middle East as imperialistic, self-interested, or sectarian. In Rosario, Argentina, a 1916 recruitment meeting at a church went bad when a mob of Syrians from the neighborhood stormed it in protest. Lebanon League recruiters joined French officials in a church to discuss migrants fighting under the French flag, a project connected to now Muqarrasol. Local Sunni Muslim leaders opposed this campaign, and they led a demonstration that turned into a violent confrontation involving over 100 men outside the church. One person was killed in the melee, 16 more were hospitalized, and dozens more were arrested. The Argentinian government sanctioned the French consulate for its role in the riot. Nevertheless, the campaign yielded a trickle of recruits. Their passage to France was paid jointly by the French Foreign Ministry and by the deposed Emir of Buenos Aires himself, Amin Arslan. The war in Syria ended in October of 1918 with the Ottoman Empire's defeat at the hands of the Allies. As Turkish troops evacuated the Arab lands, leaving them under Allied control, Syrian activists abroad quickly reorganized themselves into formal political parties and petitioned the great powers in service to programmatic nationalist agendas. Already in control of the Syrian press and in most cases having experience working with the Entente powers during the war, these diasporic political parties were reasonably well positioned to have their voices heard at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. The diaspora, its petitions, and its delegates commanded a legibility in this space in part because of the previous war work of its activists. And so the diaspora's politics came home to the Middle East in 1919, and it did so with all of its internal contradictions and complications. This is not to say, however, that the Syrians in the diaspora got what they wanted out of the so-called Wilsonian moment. It's also not to say that the resulting power configurations in the Middle East were the result of their having conspired with foreign powers. Ultimately, what my research shows is that Syrian and Lebanese activists abroad sought independence for their homeland, and they had tried to use their privileged access to the League of Nations to realize that independence. However, having spent the war grooming its own partners in diaspora, the French Foreign Ministry instrumentalized these links in 1919, and they crafted a significant legal fiction that 500,000 Syrian and Lebanese exiles had supported a French mandate in the Middle East, and that they had indeed invited France to come and rule her. The French actively promoted activities in this diaspora to feed this public perception. They subsidized pro-French Syrian parties in the Americas. They printed pro-French propaganda in Arabic there. The middle periodical, the middle photo in this slide is actually a French subsidized newspaper that was produced in Havana in Cuba in order to create the perception that the Syrians who lived in Havana supported French rule in the Middle East. The French also paid petitioners to lobby for a French mandate in Lebanon. All of these papers, broadsides, propaganda, petitions loaded with signatures in support of French rule from the Syrian diaspora, all of these were sent back to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, where French officials erstwhile employed procedural tactics in order to block anti-colonial voices and anti-colonial delegates from entry. The result was that once the League of Nations resolved to give the Syrian mandate to France in April of 1920, there had emerged a consensus among these great powers, these policymakers in Europe, that the Arab diaspora had entirely supported this idea of a French mandate, and that they had done so even against their homeland compatriots who instead rose up in rebellion. One thing I do in my book is to make lie of this narrative, illustrating that it appeared first in the League of Nations archives, archives that to this point have formed the basis for much historical research into the immediate post-Ottoman moment in Syria and Lebanon. A legal fiction, once repeated and repeated often enough, becomes the basis for historical fiction. Far from colonial middlemen, I argue that the Arab diaspora experienced the French mandate in the 1920s through the same patterns of coercion, pacification, and partition that defined the mandate's policies in the Middle East itself. Anti-colonial nationalists from abroad were ignored by the great powers, and they were locked out of the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Like the party on the right-hand side of this slide, calling itself the New Syria National League, this was a party headquartered in New York City and led by decommissioned Syrian American army officers. They brought petitions endorsing Syria's immediate independence from the Ottoman Empire, loaded with thousands of signatures, but they were turned away, ironically, because the French complained that as an émigré organization, they lacked sufficient representation within Syria itself. Given the Syria mandate by the League of Nations in 1920, France separated the territory to create the new state of Greater Lebanon. But in Lebanon in particular, the new French mandate was simultaneously dependent on the diaspora as a source of political legitimacy, and also deeply uneasy about the role that Lebanese immigrants would expect to play in Lebanon's politics. This combination of dependency and ambivalence is evident in the mandate's first policies for Lebanon, for instance, in the first national census conducted in 1921. As the mandate's first administrative point of contact with its new subject populations in Lebanon, the 1921 census categorized all of those living within Lebanon's borders in terms of their religious confession. The count was done this way in order to underpin Lebanon's new electoral college, defined by a system of balanced office holding through sectarian quotas. The French High Commissioner initiated the system with the assumption that Lebanese Christians represented a simple majority within Lebanon's new borders. However, Lebanon's enlargement in 1920 to include the Muslim districts to the south, as well as in the Bekaa Valley in sort of interior Lebanon, all of the addition of these territories challenged that assumed demography, prompting the French mandate to call for the inclusion of the country's largely Christian diaspora in the census. So, you know, maybe you want to pause the video and look at this more deeply, but what we want to take away from it is that this column that's shaded in yellow, well, these are the general totals, and if you go down to the little red box, you'll see totals present in Lebanon. You'll see that 130,000 Lebanese immigrants were added to those totals to create the new total for Lebanese populations. So 130,000 Lebanese immigrants were counted in all. Now, because French consular staff had limited access to these Lebanese communities in the Americas, the mandate delegated the actual counting of immigrants to church authorities and other clergy already abroad, especially clergy in the Maronite Church. The resulting statistics created a Christian majority for Lebanon at a ratio of 6:5, meaning there were 6 Christian parliamentary seats for every 5 Muslim ones. This same ratio was replicated in Lebanon's second census conducted in 1932, which remains the country's most recent accounting of its populations until today, in 2020. Counting Lebanese immigrants in the census achieved a demographic balancing act that the French mandate believed favorable for the Republican administration they were building there. It created unquestioned political preeminence for French partners in the region. But participating in the census also piqued the political expectations of Lebanese living abroad. They believed for a moment, you know, they would be given Lebanese nationality, Lebanese citizenship, or even suffrage in Lebanese national elections. Though constituting nearly a fifth of Lebanon's imagined community, the Lebanese abroad remained bitterly divided over whether France had the right to rule Lebanon in the first place, or indeed whether Lebanon, whether its borders in relationship with Syria should exist. For many, being counted in the census set up new spaces for claims making against the French mandate state. So the symbolic legitimacy that the diaspora conferred to the French mandate was constantly tempered or even threatened by the persistent loud shouting of Lebanese migrants who congregated in protest outside the French consulates of the Americas in the 1920s. Meanwhile, French officials in Beirut and Damascus were deeply anxious about the prospect of Arab migrants returning from the Americas to go back to Syria or Lebanon. As former Ottoman subjects, the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne theoretically guaranteed all of them the right to opt into Syrian or Lebanese nationality and to return to the Middle East. According to Lausanne, Arab Americans had a 3-year window to assert a nationality claim at one of the French consulates in the Americas. In practice, though, French diplomatic staff stalled nationality petitions and subjected the applicants to them to various political tests. Over 90% of such petitions were denied, raising protest and ire by nationalists who were seeking to liberate Lebanon and Syria through planned repatriation. At the same time, the nationality option was a controversial one among Syrian and Lebanese migrant communities. After all, wouldn't applying for citizenship with the mandate just legitimate French rule? What if exercising the nationality option undermined Arab Americans' right to remain abroad in the Americas? Would it produce something that we might identify today as self-deportation? But on the other hand, what else was available to these former Ottoman subjects other than statelessness? These were questions that Syrian and Lebanese families asked one another as their community was force-fitted into the inflexible cartographic molds of the bordered nation state. In the end, a combination of discouraging French bureaucracy and émigré ambivalence about the project yielded a paltry 2 to 5% of Lebanese immigrants who had successfully obtained Lebanese nationality by the end of the 1920s. Only a fraction of that figure successfully invoked Syrian nationality, and the mandate was categorically hostile to potential repatriation of migrants to Syria. The French mandate spent the 1920s cutting the ties of nationality that existed between Syria, Lebanon, and their respective diasporic populations, just one part of a politics that I describe as the partitioning of this diaspora. In the 20s and 30s, the mandate also denied immigrants passport documents and travel passes, effectively marooning them abroad and oftentimes segmenting families apart permanently. French officials also prohibited new travel out from Syria and Lebanon to the Americas, whether on temporary or permanent bases. When the United States stepped up its own powers of deportation in the 1920s, the French participated in bilateral deportation diplomacy with the United States to return clandestine Lebanese migrants to the Middle East. And in Beirut and Damascus, the French High Commissioner censored the Syrian press from abroad, banning the importation of newspapers printed in Sao Paulo, New York City, and Buenos Aires, many of them anti-French and anti-colonial newspapers. At the same time, and especially in Lebanon, popular memory cohered around the idea that it was the Syrians and Lebanese and diaspora who had supported this whole colonial mandate enterprise. After all, wasn't it the diaspora that declared war on the Ottoman state in 1915? My book ends with this grand irony, that the way that historians have told the story of this diaspora up to now are conditioned by what was actually an act of governance, of coercion, and of documentary partition. Official archives, state records, and the papers of the League of Nations all invoke this diaspora as a site for colonial collaboration. The research I presented today builds instead on the fragmentary records left behind by Syrian and Lebanese migrants themselves, including those now stuck in diaspora. It reveals the mandate's partition of the diaspora was so complete that until now, it had actually bifurcated history. So I guess the best place to end this talk is to tell you what became of this guy, the embattled Emir of Argentina, former Ottoman consul Amin Arslan. Arslan had spent the First World War in Argentina, agitating against the Ottoman state. When the war ended in 1918, he had petitioned the United States asking for US aid to reconstruct his battered homeland and save it from a feared French imperialism. In that petition, he pleaded with Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, "Sir, my parents are dead. My ancestral home has fallen to ruin." Instead of deliverance, he watched one empire fall and he watched another rise up in its place. 5 more years passed, but again, Arslan ascended the stairs outside of a consulate. This time it was a French consulate, and it was October of 1925. Unable to put down a local rebellion in Syria, French planes launched an aerial bombardment on Damascus, razing entire neighborhoods and killing over 10,000 unarmed civilians. Angry in Argentina, Arslan marched up the steps of the French consulate, and behind him, 1,000 Syrians from the neighborhood followed. They shouted and wept outside the consulate building, and they hollered, defiant and facing off against stiff French officials who hid behind tightly shuttered windows. Arslan turned to face the crowd, raising his hand to silence them. He then raised a rumpled paper from his jacket pocket, and he inhaled deeply with the gravity of the words he was about to speak. Like many documents, his words in this letter from October of 1925 have not survived the archive. But for 500,000 Syrians and Lebanese in this diaspora, there continued this obligation, a political responsibility that crossed oceans, splashed across newspaper headlines, and murmured in the parlors of Syrian cafes and shops from Sao Paulo to Boston. Theirs was a revolt that helped topple the Ottomans. It was one that duly rejected the borders imposed by European powers and the League of Nations which represented them. For Syria and Syrians, the diaspora acted as an offshore frontier province, a critical space for nationalist and anti-colonial politics, unpoliced and ungovernable by the bordered state. The history of these migrants and of their politics is worth reclaiming from the vicissitudes of archives not built for them, and from the geopolitical quirks of humanistic area studies. Thank you. Okay, so that concludes the pre-recorded portion of this lecture. I look forward to hearing your questions, to having a conversation about diaspora, about Syrian migration, and about World War I on May 7th. I hope you all tune in then. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or Jennifer Alpers, the History Club coordinator for this event. So long, guys. See you soon.